France, August 1944. In a makeshift detention facility outside Caen, 32 captured German medical personnel waited in temporary cells for processing and transport. The building had been a schoolhouse once, its small rooms now locked, each holding 2 or 3 prisoners. When Corporal James Mitchell and Private David Chun opened the door to room 7, the woman inside began screaming, not words, just raw, animal sound that filled the corridor and made both soldiers freeze. She was 28 years old, a nurse named Helene Richter, and she had not stopped shaking since her capture 3 days earlier. What happened in the next 5 minutes would violate every regulation in the Army manual. Helene Richter had been a nurse for 6 years, trained in Berlin, assigned to field hospitals that followed the German Army across Poland, France, and Russia. She was competent and efficient, treating shrapnel wounds and dysentery with equal professional detachment. By 1944, stationed at a mobile hospital outside Caen, she had seen enough suffering to fill several lifetimes. The wounded arrived in endless waves, soldiers torn apart by artillery, burned by phosphorus, poisoned by gas. She cleaned wounds, administered morphine, held hands while men died, and moved immediately to the next patient. The work numbed her. It had to. Feeling too much would have made it impossible to function. So she performed her duties mechanically, saved who could be saved, eased the passing of those who could not, and tried not to think about what any of it meant. The Allied invasion in June changed everything. The hospital moved constantly, staying ahead of advancing forces, operating in barns and abandoned buildings, and once in a cathedral that smelled of incense and blood. Supplies dwindled. Wounded accumulated. The staff worked 20-hour days, slept in shifts, ate when they remembered. On August 7th, American forces overran their position. The hospital was in a converted farmhouse, clearly marked with red crosses, but surrounded by retreating German units. Artillery fell nearby. Small arms fire cracked through the trees. The senior doctor, a man named Weber, made the decision. They would not evacuate. They had 50 wounded men who could not be moved. The staff would stay, continue treating patients, and surrender to whoever arrived first. American infantry found them that afternoon. Young soldiers, nervous and trigger-ready, shouting in English that Helene barely understood. The staff raised their hands. The wounded watched from their cots, too injured to do more than breathe. An American officer, a captain, entered the ward. He looked at the wounded, at the medical staff with their bloody aprons and exhausted faces, and said something to his sergeant. The sergeant nodded, posted guards, and the Americans withdrew. For a moment, nothing changed. The hospital continued operating under guard, the staff still treating patients. Then orders came from division headquarters. All German medical personnel were to be detained pending interrogation and classification. They were taken in trucks, leaving the wounded in the care of American medics. Helene watched through the canvas as the farmhouse disappeared. She had spent 2 months there. She knew every wounded man's name. Now she would never know if they survived. The detention facility had been established in a school on the outskirts of Caen. The building was damaged, missing part of its roof, but structurally sound. 3 classrooms converted to holding areas, a dozen small rooms for individual or paired detention. Helene was placed in room 7 with another nurse, an older woman named Martha, who had worked at a hospital in Munich before the war. The room was small, 8 feet by 10 feet, containing 2 cots, a bucket for waste, a small barred window too high to see through. The first day passed in numbed silence. Both women sat on their cots, not speaking, processing the reality of capture. They were prisoners now. Their future was uncertain. The war continued somewhere beyond these walls, but they were no longer part of it. The second day, interrogators came. American intelligence officers asking questions through translators. Names, ranks, unit assignments, knowledge of military operations. Helene answered truthfully. She was a nurse. She treated wounded. She knew nothing about strategy or deployments. The interrogator seemed satisfied. She would be classified as medical personnel, protected under Geneva Convention protocols, and eventually transferred to a POW camp for processing and repatriation. On the third day, something broke inside her. It started with a dream. Helene rarely remembered dreams, but this one was vivid. The field hospital in Russia during winter, treating a young soldier with a chest wound. She could not stop the bleeding. The boy died while she pressed gauze into the wound, his blood warm on her hands, his eyes staring at nothing. She woke gasping, momentarily confused about where she was. The cell was dark. Martha slept on the adjacent cot. The building was silent except for distant voices and footsteps. And then the memory overwhelmed her. Not just the one dream, but all of them. Every wounded soldier, every amputation, every mercy she could not provide, every death she witnessed. 6 years of accumulated trauma crashed through the walls she had built to contain it. She started shaking. Her hands first, then her whole body. She could not stop, could not breathe properly, could not remember where she was or why. Martha woke, tried to comfort her, but Helene could not hear the words. She was back in the hospital tent in Poland, in the farmhouse in France, in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. She was everywhere and nowhere, trapped in a loop of memory and horror. By morning, she had not stopped shaking. Martha called for the guards, tried to explain that Helene needed medical attention. The guards spoke no German, assumed it was a trick or a ploy for sympathy. They locked the door and moved on. When Corporal James Mitchell and Private David Schoon opened the door to room 7 that afternoon, they were conducting a routine check of all detention cells. Security protocol required visual confirmation of prisoners twice daily. Simple procedure. Open door, count prisoners, ensure no escape attempts, close door, move to next cell. Mitchell turned the key, pushed the door open, and the screaming began. Helene was standing in the center of the room, hands over her ears, eyes squeezed shut, making a sound that was barely human. High-pitched and continuous, a release of everything she had been holding inside for 6 years. Mitchell froze. He had been in combat, had heard men scream in pain and fear, but this was different. This was something breaking, the sound of a mind shattering under pressure it could no longer contain. Chun stood behind him, equally frozen. "What the hell?" he said. Martha tried to speak over the screaming, explaining in rapid German that Helene was ill, that she needed a doctor, that something had happened during the night. Mitchell understood no German. He only saw a woman screaming and another woman trying to restrain her. His training said to close the door, report the situation, let officers handle it. But something in the sound made him hesitate. Chun touched his shoulder. "We should get a medic." Mitchell nodded slowly. "Stay here. Keep the door open. I'll find someone." He ran down the corridor, leaving Chun watching 2 German women in a cell, one screaming, one pleading, while he violated the first rule of prisoner management. Never leave a guard alone with multiple detainees. Chun stood in the doorway, uncomfortable and uncertain. Helene continued screaming, though the sound was weakening, becoming hoarse. Martha held her arms, trying to calm her, speaking softly in German. Chun was 22, from Seattle, drafted a year earlier. He had landed in France 6 weeks after D-Day, seen combat during the push through Normandy, and been reassigned to rear echelon duties after taking shrapnel in his shoulder. Guarding prisoners was supposed to be safe, boring work while he recovered. This was neither safe nor boring. Helene's screaming stopped abruptly. She crumpled to the floor, sobbing, still shaking. Martha knelt beside her, cradling her head, murmuring comfort. Chun made a decision that would have resulted in disciplinary action if reported. He stepped into the cell. Protocol said guards never entered without backup. But this woman was clearly in distress, and waiting might make it worse. He knelt a few feet away, speaking slowly in English. "It's okay. We're getting help. You're going to be okay." Helene looked up at him with wild, unfocused eyes. She did not understand the words, but something in the tone penetrated the panic. She stared at him like he was the first human being she had seen in days. Chun did something else that violated protocol. He pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket part of his ration, saved for later, and offered it to her. Martha took it hesitantly, broke off a piece, pressed it into Helene's hand. Helene looked at the chocolate like she did not recognize what it was. Then she put it in her mouth, the sweetness shocking against her tongue, and started crying harder. Mitchell came back 10 minutes later with a medic, a sergeant named Thomas, who had been a general practitioner in civilian life. Thomas assessed the situation quickly. American guard in a cell with 2 German prisoners, one having what appeared to be a severe psychological break. "Corporal," Thomas said carefully, "you want to tell me why you're in there?" "She collapsed," Mitchell said. "Private Chun was keeping her stable until you arrived." It was a lie. Chun had entered the cell before Helene collapsed. But Thomas recognized what Mitchell was doing, covering for a protocol violation that came from compassion rather than negligence. "All right," Thomas said. "Let me examine her." He entered the cell now 3 Americans with 2 German prisoners, a security nightmare, and knelt beside Helene. He checked her pulse, looked at her eyes, spoke to her in English she could not understand. "She's in shock," Thomas said. "Severe psychological trauma." "Has she been like this long?" Martha answered in broken English. "Since last night. She cannot stop shaking. She remembers too much." Thomas nodded slowly. He understood immediately. Combat fatigue. Shell shock. Whatever you wanted to call it, the condition was the same. A mind overwhelmed by experiences it was never meant to process. "She needs rest," Thomas said. "Real rest, not a cell. And probably sedation. Can we move her to the medical area?" Mitchell asked. Thomas shook his head. "The medical area is for American personnel. Regulations are clear. And what do we do?" Thomas considered. The regulations were clear, but so was the situation. A sick woman who needed care. The oath he had taken as a doctor preceded his oath as a soldier. "We treat her here," Thomas said. "I'll get supplies. You 2 stay with them. Keep them calm. If anyone asks, I'm conducting a medical examination per Geneva Convention requirements." It was technically true. Also technically a violation of security protocols. But none of them mentioned that. Thomas returned with morphine, clean water, bandages, anything he could justify taking for a medical examination. He administered a small dose of morphine to calm Helene's shaking, gave her water to drink, spoke to her in English, while Martha translated haltingly. "You're safe," Thomas said. "No one is going to hurt you. You're going to rest now." Helene's eyes were clearer, the morphine taking effect. She whispered something in German that Martha translated. "Why are you helping me?" Thomas looked at Mitchell and Chun, then back to Helene. "Because you're sick and I'm a doctor. It's that simple." Helene started crying again, but quietly now. Martha held her hand, tears on her own face. Mitchell and Chun stood by the door, watching this scene that violated every regulation about prisoner interaction. They should have left, should have reported this, should have maintained professional distance. Instead, they stayed. Over the next 3 hours, a rotation of guards found reasons to check on Room 7. Word had spread through the detention facility. Corporal Mitchell and Private Chun were sitting with 2 German prisoners, one having a medical crisis, violating protocols, but doing something that felt right. Each guard who checked offered something. Extra water, a blanket, once someone brought food from the mess. No one reported the violations. They all understood implicitly. Sometimes the rules had to bend. Helene slept, the morphine and exhaustion finally overwhelming the panic. Martha sat beside her cot, occasionally looking up at the Americans with expressions of confusion and gratitude. Mitchell and Shun took turns sitting in the cell and standing guard at the door. When an officer came by, Lieutenant conducting rounds Mitchell stepped into the corridor and explained, "Medical emergency. Sir, Sergeant Thomas is treating one of the prisoners." The lieutenant looked past him into the cell, saw the scene, and made a choice. "Carry on, Corporal. Ensure the medic documents everything properly." He walked away without asking details he would then have to officially acknowledge. As evening approached, Martha's English proved better than her initial broken phrases suggested. She began talking to Chun, who remained in the cell while Mitchell took door duty. "You are Chinese?" Martha asked. "Chinese-American," Chun replied. "My parents came from Canton. And you fight for America against us?" Chun nodded. "It's my country. When your country calls, you answer." Martha considered this. "In Germany, we were told America was divided, that different peoples fought each other." "Propaganda," Chun said simply. "Like you were probably told Americans would mistreat prisoners." Martha glanced at Helene, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. "Yes, we were told many lies." "Why did she break?" Chun asked quietly. "What happened to her?" Martha's expression darkened. 6 years of war. 6 years of seeing wounded soldiers, of amputating limbs, of watching men die. She never talked about it, never cried. Just worked and worked and worked. I think it all finally became too much. Chun understood. He had seen soldiers crack under pressure, good men who suddenly could not continue. The mind was not built for constant trauma. Eventually, something had to give. "Is she a good nurse?" he asked. "The best," Martha said. She cared about every patient. She would skip sleep to sit with dying men so they would not be alone. That kind of compassion cost something. I think the cost finally came due. Sergeant Thomas returned at dusk to check on Helene. She was awake, calmer, the sedation wearing off, but the worst of the crisis passed. He examined her again, made notes in a small book, and spoke to Mitchell privately in the corridor. "I'm documenting this as acute stress reaction triggered by prolonged exposure to combat casualties," Thomas said. "It's a medical condition recognized by the convention. She needs to be transferred to a facility that can provide appropriate care." "Will they do that?" Mitchell asked. "If I make the recommendation strongly enough, yes. I'll talk to the camp commander tonight." "What happens to us?" "For the protocol violations." Thomas smiled grimly. "What violations?" "I conducted a medical examination. You provided security during that examination. Private Chun assisted with patient management. Everything by the book. We sat with her for 3 hours. The examination required extended observation. Still by the book." Mitchell nodded slowly. "Thank you, Sergeant." "Don't thank me," Thomas said. "You did the right thing. Sometimes that's more important than regulations." The camp commander, Major Richard Stern, was 45 and pragmatic. He had commanded rear area operations for 18 months, dealt with thousands of prisoners, and developed a philosophy. Follow the regulations unless they actively prevented accomplishing the mission. When Thomas presented his report and recommendation, Stern faced a choice. Transfer one German nurse to a medical facility because she had a psychological breakdown, or keep her in detention with minimal care. The regulations said POWs with medical conditions should receive appropriate treatment. But resources were limited. Medical facilities were overloaded with American casualties, and transferring one enemy prisoner for mental health reasons could create a precedent. Stern read Thomas's report twice, then asked, "Is she a security risk?" "No, sir," Thomas replied. "She's a nurse who broke under strain. She needs rest and treatment, not detention." And the men who stayed with her, Mitchell and Chun, They violated security protocols. They responded to a medical emergency, sir. I was present for most of it. Stern understood what Thomas was really saying. Don't punish compassion. The regulations existed to maintain order, not to prevent basic decency. All right, Stern said. Transfer her to the field hospital at Bayeux. They have a psych ward. I'll authorize it as a medical necessity. And the men? No action. They followed their conscience in an ambiguous situation. That's what we want soldiers to do. The next morning, Helene was transported to the American field hospital at Bayeux. Martha went with her. Thomas had argued that separating them would worsen Helene's condition, and keeping them together cost nothing. Mitchell and Chun were assigned to escort duty. Another protocol deviation prisoners were typically transported by dedicated security personnel, but no one objected. The drive took 90 minutes. Helene sat in the back of the truck, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the French countryside passing by. She had stopped shaking. The worst of the crisis had passed, leaving behind exhaustion and a strange clarity. Martha sat beside her, occasionally speaking quietly in German. Helene responded in monosyllables, still processing everything that had happened. At one point, she looked at Chun, sitting across from her, and said something in German. Martha translated. She wants to thank you. For the chocolate. For staying. Chun felt uncomfortable with gratitude. I didn't do anything special. Martha translated this. Helene shook her head and spoke again. Martha translated. You treated her like a human being. In war, that is very special. The field hospital at Bayeux was a cluster of tents and converted buildings handling both American and German wounded. The psychiatric ward was a small building at the edge of the complex, quiet and relatively private. A doctor named Captain Sarah Morrison took charge of Helene's case. She was 32, trained in psychiatry before the war, now treating soldiers with combat fatigue and trauma-induced conditions. After examining Helene and reading Thomas's report, Morrison sat down with Mitchell and Chun while Helene rested in the ward. Sergeant Thomas did good work, Morrison said. Quick intervention probably prevented a complete breakdown. Another few days in that cell, she might not have recovered. What happens to her now? Mitchell asked. Treatment, rest, time to process what she experienced. Eventually, when she's stable, transfer to a proper POW camp. She'll probably go home after the war ends. Will she be okay? Morrison considered the question. Some people recover fully from this kind of trauma. Some carry it forever. It depends on the person, the support they receive, what they do with their experiences. But she has a chance now. Without your intervention, she might not have had that. Before returning to their duties, Mitchell and Chun visited Helene in the ward. She was sitting on a bed by a window, Martha beside her, both women looking more rested than they had in days. Through Martha's translation, they had a brief conversation. How are you feeling? Chun asked. Better, Helene replied. Thank you for what you did. You broke rules for me. Sometimes rules need to be broken, Mitchell said. Helene smiled faintly. In Germany, we were taught rules must never be broken, that orders were absolute. But you Americans seem to think rules are ... suggestions? More like guidelines, Chun said. The goal is to do the right thing. Rules help most of the time, but when they don't, you improvise. Helene nodded slowly. I like that philosophy. I wish we had been taught it. There was nothing more to say. Mitchell and Chun left, returning to their duties at the detention facility. Helene and Martha remained in the hospital, beginning the slow process of healing. None of them expected to meet again. The war would separate them, send them to different places, different fates. But for one day in August 1944, their paths had crossed, and something small, but significant had happened. Compassion had trumped protocol, and everyone involved had been changed by it. Helene spent 6 weeks at the Bahia psychiatric ward. Captain Morrison worked with her daily, using talk therapy and rest to help process 6 years of accumulated trauma. The sessions were difficult. Helene had to confront memories she had buried. The soldier in Russia who bled to death while she pressed gauze into his chest. The boy in Poland who lost both legs and begged her to let him die. The officer in France who held her hand and whispered about his children while morphine eased his final hours. Each memory had been compartmentalized, locked away so she could continue functioning. Now Morrison helped her open those compartments one by one, examine the contents, and find ways to live with what she had seen. "You were a good nurse," Morrison told her during one session. "You saved lives and eased suffering. That matters." "But I served the regime," Helene replied. "I helped soldiers return to fight. How many people died because I healed men who went back to battle?" Morrison had no easy answer. The moral complications of wartime medical care were profound. But she offered what she could. You treated wounded humans. That's all any medical professional can do. What political leaders do with healthy soldiers is beyond your control. Helene was not sure she believed this, but it helped. Slightly. Martha, though not officially a patient, benefited from the ward's environment. She began keeping a journal, documenting her experiences and observations. August 25, 1944. Helene is improving slowly. The American doctor, Captain Morrison, is skilled and kind. I am surprised by this. We were taught American medicine was inferior, that their doctors were poorly trained. Another lie. August 30th. I have been thinking about the soldiers who helped us, Mitchell and Chun. They violated their regulations to treat Helene with compassion. In Germany, such deviation from rules would be punished severely. Here, it seems to be accepted, even encouraged. What does it say about a country that trusts its soldiers to make moral decisions? September 5th. Helene and I discussed what we will do after the war. Neither of us wants to return to nursing immediately. Too many memories. But Captain Morrison says trauma does not have to define us. That we can choose what to carry forward and what to leave behind. I want to believe this. In September, Mitchell received an unexpected item in his mail call. A letter written in careful English, translated by Martha from Helene's German. Dear Corporal Mitchell, I am writing to thank you for your kindness when I was in distress. I know you violated regulations to help me, and I want you to understand how much that meant. For 6 years, I followed orders without question. I believed that duty required absolute obedience, that rules existed to be obeyed regardless of circumstances. You taught me something different, that sometimes the most important duty is to conscience, not to regulations. I am recovering under Captain Morrison's care. The nightmares are less frequent. The shaking has stopped. I can think about the future now, something I could not do before. I do not know what will happen after the war. I will probably return to Germany, though I am not sure what I will find there. But I know that I will remember your kindness and try to show the same compassion to others. With gratitude, Helene Richter Mitchell read the letter several times, then showed it to Chun. They sat in their barracks, neither speaking for a long moment. Finally, Chun said, "We did the right thing." Yeah, Mitchell agreed. We did. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Helene and Martha were transferred to a POW camp in England, then repatriated to Germany in the summer of 1946. They traveled together, a friendship forged in crisis and sustained through months of displacement. Germany was unrecognizable. Hamburg, where both women had trained as nurses, was largely rubble. The country was divided, occupied, its future uncertain. The propaganda that had shaped their youth was revealed as lies built on atrocities they had not fully understood. Helene returned to nursing eventually, but in a civilian hospital, treating accident victims and sick children. She never worked in a military context again. The memories were too heavy. Martha became a teacher, working in schools that educated German children about what had really happened during the war. She used her own experiences to illustrate how propaganda works, how ordinary people can be led into complicity with evil. Both women lived into their 80s, carried the memories of that August day in France for the rest of their lives. Mitchell remained in the Army after the war, made a career of it. Retired as a sergeant major in 1968, he served in Korea and Vietnam, saw more combat than he ever wanted, and never forgot the lesson of that day in France, that sometimes compassion matters more than protocol. He told the story often to young soldiers under his command, to his children and grandchildren. The German nurse who started screaming, the decision to stay with her despite regulations, the understanding that rules exist to serve humanity, not the other way around. Chun returned to civilian life, used the GI Bill to become a teacher in Seattle. He taught history, emphasizing the human stories within larger events. One story he repeated every year, the day he gave a chocolate bar to an enemy prisoner having a psychological break, and how that small act of kindness rippled outward. In 1985, he received a letter from Germany. It was from Martha, now 81, writing to tell him that Helene had passed away peacefully. She wanted him to know that Helene had never forgotten him, had spoken often about the American soldiers who treated her with compassion when she needed it most. Chun kept that letter until his own death in 2003, a reminder that small acts of decency matter even decades later. The incident appears in no official history. No military report documents the protocol violations. No record exists of Mitchell and Chun sitting in a cell with 2 German prisoners for 3 hours while a nurse recovered from psychological trauma. But the story survived anyway, passed down through families, shared in veterans groups, preserved in the memories of people who understood its significance. A historian researching psychological trauma in World War II, medical personnel discovered references to Helene S. case in Captain Morrison S. notes. Morrison had documented it carefully, recognizing its importance. German nurse admitted with acute stress reaction. Treatment successful, due in part to immediate intervention by enlisted personnel who prioritized patient welfare over security protocols. Case demonstrates the importance of allowing field personnel to exercise judgment in ambiguous situations. The historian included the story in a book about World War II medical care, giving Mitchell, Chun, Helene, and Martha's story a permanent place in the historical record. The story of Room 7 represents something essential about humanity in wartime, that compassion can exist even between enemies, that protocol can be subordinate to conscience, that small acts of kindness ripple forward through decades. Mitchell and Chun broke rules. They could have been disciplined, could have faced consequences that damaged their careers. Instead, they were quietly supported by superiors who recognized that sometimes doing the right thing requires deviation from standard procedures. Helene and Martha were enemy prisoners who received care from men they had been taught to hate. The experience did not erase the trauma they had witnessed or their complicity in serving the regime, but it showed them an alternative to the authoritarianism they had known. Years later, Helene told her daughter, "The war taught me many lessons, most of them terrible. But one lesson was good, that individuals can choose compassion, even when systems demand cruelty. 2 American soldiers chose to treat me as a human being when regulations said I was just an enemy prisoner. That choice changed my understanding of everything." The schoolhouse in Cannes no longer exists, demolished during post-war reconstruction. The field hospital at Bayeux is long gone. The people involved are all dead now, their memories carried forward only by descendants and historians. But the story persists as a reminder that in the machinery of war, there are moments when individual humanity breaks through. When a woman screams in a cell, and 2 soldiers decide that compassion matters more than protocol. When a medic treats an enemy patient with the same care he would give his own soldiers. When a commander looks at regulations and decides that sometimes the right thing requires bending rules, these moments do not change the course of wars. They do not appear in strategic analyses or military doctrine, but they change the people involved, create ripples that extend through generations, and prove that even in the darkest circumstances, decency remains possible. In a small room in France in August 1944, a German nurse broke under the weight of trauma, and American soldiers caught her. That is the story. That is what endures.